It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm very honored to be part of a seminar that focuses on women's rights. And I'm happy to be here to be able to share with you my concerns about the violations of rights of women in my birth country, Iran. Living in a secular and democratic country like Canada, sometimes it's really easy to take for granted the rights that we have. The right to choose what to wear, the right to choose what to study, the right to choose our own career path, the right to choose our partners, and the types of relationships that we want to have. Unfortunately, in many Islamic countries, including Iran, women don't even have these very basic rights. Unfortunately, in many Islamic countries, including Iran, women don't even have these very basic rights. Before delving into the rest of my presentation, I want to give you a little bit of background about who I am so that you have some idea why I'm here and speaking to you on this topic today. I was born in 1980 in Iran, right a year after the revolution, when the Islamic clerics took over the Iranian government and they implemented the Islamic Sharia law. When I was 7 years old, I was forced to flee from Iran along with my family, my dad, my mom, and my two siblings, because my father was an opponent of the regime. He had been arrested once and released, but it was just a matter of time before he would be rearrested and probably executed. So we were forced to flee from Iran. We lived in Turkey for 5 years before being able to come to Canada under very terrible conditions. And while those were difficult times for me, I feel very fortunate to be able to live in Canada, to have grown up here in a secular and democratic country where I was able to be who I wanted to be, and I have been able to say what I've needed to say without fearing persecution, fearing torture, arrest, rape, and even execution. Unfortunately, women in my birth country, Iran, are not as lucky. Growing up and living under the Sharia law is not fun. As young women grow up in Iran, they're forced for wanting to cover themselves. Even at the early age of 9, they've told what to wear, that they have to cover themselves and wear the Islamic hijab. If a woman doesn't have the proper hijab, or if they decide to disobey the law, they're arrested and they're flogged. Young women are not allowed to wear makeup or nail polish. They're not allowed to travel without the permission of their male guardians. Women are not allowed to have relationships outside of marriage. If they are caught having a relationship outside of marriage, they're arrested, they're flogged, and many of them are stoned to death. And the barbaric practice of stoning still continues in Iran by the Islamic regime. Same-sex relationships are also not allowed in Iran, and women that do choose to enter into same-sex relationships are persecuted, they face flogging and even execution. While 60% of university students in Iran are women, there are laws that ban women from entering into certain fields of study. Just recently, in 2012, the Islamic regime passed a law that banned women from entering into 77 different fields in universities. And that includes anything along the lines of English literature, biology, mining engineering. And this was a part of Islamic regime's efforts to push back women into the homes and not to allow them to be part of the productive members of society. Women in Iran have not fared any better in family law either. Girls as young as 9 years old can be married off with the permission of their guardian. Under Sharia law, men can have 4 wives. Under Sharia law, men can have as many temporary wives as they would like on top of the 4 permanent wives. And you might ask, what is a temporary marriage? A man and a woman can go to an imam, to a cleric, and they can be asked to be married temporarily. And this could be from minutes to 99 years. But essentially what this law does is it legalizes prostitution, and it allows for men to take advantage of women who are economically disadvantaged. Husbands in Iran can forbid their wives from working and from studying. Upon divorce, women lose the custody of their children automatically. If they have a son, they lose the custody at 2 years of age. If they have a daughter, they lose the custody at 7 years. And because of that, a lot of women choose to stay in violent relationships or in the relationships where the men get other wives because they don't want to lose the custody of their children. The newest law, which has caused a lot of concern, especially for me, is a law that allows for adopted parents to marry their adopted children. This is a very recent law, and even though it's a gender-neutral law, it mostly would apply to young girls who may be forced into marrying their adopted fathers. And this law is really legalizing not only pedophilia, but it's also normalizing incest, which is certainly not something that's in the Iranian culture. And this law also turns the daughter, the adopted daughter, into a competition for the mother. So the mother always is looking at the adopted daughter as a competitor who could be marrying her husband rather than a daughter, and that also creates all sorts of problems, as you can imagine. Now, you might wonder, how is it that the Islamic regime is able to oppress women and continue their systematic, essentially, persecution of women? They're able to do this, they're able to get away with it because the international community is staying silent about it. And now we know what the problem is, but I want to discuss what is the solution and what can we do. A couple of months ago, I came across this really amazing quote, which I think it applies here. The best way to protect anyone's rights is to protect everyone's rights. And this especially applies to the situation in Iran. Today, I've listed various ways in which women in Iran are oppressed and essentially treated as second-class citizens. But the oppression by the Islamic regime is in no way just limited to the women of Iran. Islamic regime is a brutal dictatorship that has executed more than 100,000 political prisoners in the last 34 years. The number of people who have been arrested, tortured, raped are even larger because of their political beliefs. Islamic regime does not allow for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. Both religious and ethnic minorities are persecuted in Iran, as are individuals who enter into same-sex relationships. Political opponents are arbitrarily arrested, tortured, raped, and executed on a regular basis. Islamic regime's rate of execution, which has always been extremely high, has even increased since the so-called moderate president was elected in the summer of last year, Hassan Rouhani. As I stand here today, many political prisoners and non-political prisoners are facing execution. In fact, this week is the International Week to Stand with a young woman that's facing execution, Reyhaneh Jaberi. Ms. Jaberi is a 26-year-old young woman who has spent the past 7 years of her life in the Islamic regime prisons. Her crime? Defending herself against her rapist, who also happened to be a member of the Ministry of Intelligence in Iran. Ms. Jaberi's execution has been approved by the Supreme Court, and it is imminent. And unfortunately, many other women like her are facing execution and facing the same fate in Iran for fighting against violence and fighting against rape. What should we do and what can we do? I see the Islamic regime as a cancer and the human rights violations as symptoms of the cancer. Now, we could focus on those symptoms and try to deal with them individually, or we could focus on the cancer itself and get rid of it permanently. In order for human rights in general and women's rights in particular to flourish in Iran, the number one thing is the Islamic regime has to go. I refer to myself as a pro-democracy activist rather than a human rights activist, because in order for us to have human rights in Iran, first we have to establish democracy. That's the key. Now, democracy and regime change in Iran has to come from the people of Iran. It has to be a government by the people and for the people. But that doesn't mean that the international community, and especially countries like Canada, don't have a role. They do. And while the pro-democracy movement inside Iran flourishes, the international community can help by isolating the Islamic regime both politically and economically through smart oil sanctions. An economically and politically isolated Islamic regime is going to be that much easier to defeat by the people of Iran. And I want to make a note that while women in Iran are being persecuted systematically, they've managed to be in the forefront of the pro-democracy movement in Iran, and the regime has not been successful in pushing them back into the homes. It's unfortunate that after the election of the so-called moderate president Rouhani, it seems like, and the new deals, the nuclear deals between the Islamic regime and the international community has turned a blind eye to the human rights violations that are taking place in Iran. And it seems like they are willing to turn a blind eye as long as there's some concessions with respect to the nuclear issue. While Canada has taken a somewhat tough stand with respect to the Islamic regime, and they have condemned the human rights violations, there is still a long way to go and a lot of room for improvement. Canadian government has to continue to isolate the Islamic regime both politically and economically through pushing for the oil sanctions. It's also important to keep the focus on human rights rather than on the nuclear issue, and both through the Canadian government and through the media. And the more we publicize what the Islamic regime is doing, the less likely they are to be doing it at the rate that they're doing right now. In Iran's case, our silence will lead to more violence. So I would ask all of you to please speak up. Thank you.